We just reviewed and ranked the first 10 UFC tournaments. Now we are going to determine who the original GOAT, the first GOAT of UFC is. Now to do this, we are just looking at UFC 1 through UFC 10. So do not come at me with Pancrase this and that and Vale Tudo tournament this. We're just looking at what they have done in the UFC up until this point. Now, before we get into the top 10, I do have a couple of honourable mentions. First of all, Steve Jenham, tournament winner, but I mean, come on, 2-1 record, and his wins are over, nobody's, and he was defeated pretty swiftly by Tank Abbott, so he doesn't make the top 10. Now, one person that I think may annoy somebody that he isn't in the top 10, especially when you see who number 10 is, but I can justify it. Paul Varelans made a tournament final, 4-3 record, I think, at this point in the game. Where Varelans isn't able to make it in here for me, look, his wins are over, again, somewhat over nobody's here. He doesn't have a win over, let's just put it this way, like a top 10 guy. His losses are pretty good, though. He lost to Dan Severn. He lost to Marco Ruas in the tournament final for UFC 7. And he lost to Tank Abbott in his, not his debut fight, but his debut event at UFC 6. He was beaten by Tank Abbott. I can totally understand putting Varelans in here at number 10. But to me, when we get to number 10, I think... Look, let's just get to number 10. We can talk about why I have him in here over Varelans. We have Kimo at number 10. Now I get it. He's got an 0-2 record against 4-3 for Varelans. But Kimo's 2 fights have been against top 5 guys. Shamrock, Gracie. Like, I think when drafting this sort of pound for pound list, you look at level of competition. He took on Shamrock for the super fight title, and his debut fight was against Royce Gracie, who was unbeaten to that point over 2 tournaments. I think he was 7-0 at that point, something like that. So, like, that's not a bad loss either. And I just think if you put Kimo against Varelans, I mean, I think Kimo might win. So, to me, Kimo comes in here at number 10. I get it. He hasn't won a fight. He has only had 2 fights against top-level opposition. Varelans, sure, he had a nice fight against Marco Ruas in the final of UFC 7. But again, against top-level opposition, he was beaten by Dan Severn in a minute. He was beaten by Tank Abbott in 2 minutes. And I don't even know if Tank Abbott is necessarily top-level competition. He makes this list. But, I mean, I think Kimo put up a better fight against better opponents. And I think if Kimo took on Varelans, Kimo would win. So he's in here at number 10 over Varelans. Number 9, Gary Goodridge. Gary Goodridge here, an even 3-3 for his UFC 1 through UFC 10 performance. Granted, he debuted at UFC 8. But he sort of suffers from the same... Like, his losses, again, top-level competition, right? That's why he comes in here above Kimo. Because where Varelans, say, lost in a minute to these guys like Tank Abbott, like Dan Severn, what have you, Gary Goodridge is actually out here losing to Mark Coleman, who it takes 7 minutes. Don Frye, okay, 2.5, but that was a tournament final that he made. And Mark Schultz, Olympic gold medalist, as a last-minute substitute. Like, Gary Goodridge's losses at this point are actually pretty good. Where he can't rank higher than number 9, though, is because his wins. Whilst he does have that iconic knockout over Paul Herrera. Like, his wins, John Campatella at UFC 10, Bolander at UFC 8. I know that Bolander would go on to have more success, but again, we're just grading from what we've seen from UFC 1 through to UFC 10, and so it doesn't really count as a top-level win yet. So whilst he hasn't beaten these top-level guys, he has beaten enough people and put up a better fight against, again, top-level guys, Schultz, Coleman, Frye, to get in here above Kimo. And then moving on, what I will say here, actually, see between Varelans as the number 11 honourable mention, 10, 9, and now number 8, Tank Abbott, not a whole lot to split the difference here between these guys. You could put these guys into any order that you wanted, and I wouldn't actually really argue with it. So long as they were between 11 and 8, you could put them in whatever order that you want, and I wouldn't really have too much of a problem with that. Tank Abbott, 3-2 record right here. His losses, Oleg Taktarov, some would say controversially, in that final, where they get stood up after Tank Abbott did, I say dominate. He was on top in the dominant position for about 15 minutes in that fight. So, not bad. His other loss, Dan Severn, who he took 18 minutes to a decision. Granted, he was not in that fight. He just got ridden up against the fence again for about 16 minutes, something like that. So where I put Tank Abbott above these guys, he has this sort of crazy knockout, like Gary Goodridge. Not maybe to the level of like iconic status that the Goodridge knockout got, but that John Matua knockout in 20 seconds, oh my good lord, if you have not seen the UFC 6 review, watch it. Insane knockout. But he ranks above Goodridge because Tank Abbott's wins, he has a win over Paul Varlins, who made a UFC final, who's sort of a mainstay at this point in the game, and he has a win over Steve Jenham. Now, strange circumstances that Steve Jenham win, because it doesn't even look as though a hold's applied. He just pressed his head against his, up against the fence. Steve Jenham tapped. They call it a neck crank. I'm not entirely convinced, right? But like, if that happened in modern day UFC, everybody's freaking the fuck out on Twitter. But look, he has a win over a tournament champion. He has a win over Varlins. That to me puts him above Goodridge, Kimo, Varlins. And his losses, again, to tournament winner Oleg Taktarov, who he took to 18 minutes, and he took Dan Severn, who we'll get to later on. He took him 18 minutes as well. Now, the decision was unanimous, but still, I think that does count for something. Moving on to number 7, we have Marco Ruas. Now, it hurts me to put him this low, because I think he's honestly one of the most well-rounded fighters in UFC, particularly at this point, where you sort of have people from one discipline who rely so heavily on that. Marco Ruas can stand up and he can go to the ground. He debuted at UFC 7, won the tournament, beat Varlins in the final, which is a solid win, and innovative in terms of UFC at least, with the use of the leg kicks, being able to chip away at Varlins, get him down, and then finish him once he'd already compromised the leg. It's strange going back and then just seeing that happen for the first time, and commentary's almost freaking out. The fans are up on their feet going crazy over these leg kicks, because it's something that you don't expect to see in a fight like this. But where Ruas can only rank here for me at number 7, because I wish he could be higher, he was only here for 2 tournaments. And whilst he did win UFC 7, when he went to the Ultimate, he had a win over Keith Hackney, who, okay, not bad, a relative mainstay for the first few events here at UFC. He then lost to Oleg Taktarov in what was a close decision, but see when decisions are close but clear, like Taktarov definitely won that fight, but I think if they rematched, Ruas could do it. It's one of those ones. And see, just because we never got to see that rematch, he was only here for 2 tournaments, and we didn't get to see him up against the highest of high-level competition. Maybe that might not have been his fault. Maybe he did want to come back and fight, and other people didn't want to fight him, because again, in terms of skill level and being a well-rounded fighter, he could rank so much higher on this list. But just in terms of what we have seen from UFC 1 through UFC 10, I can't rank Ruas any higher than number 7. Look, we get to number 6, and number 6 is Oleg Taktarov. Once we seen that fight happen at UFC, it was the Ultimate, right? Once we seen that happen at the Ultimate and Taktarov won that decision, like, Taktarov might not have as deep a bag, you could say, as Marco Ruas, but he beat him, and he beat him clean. So your ranking doesn't just lie with one result or one performance, because you look at Taktarov in his debut, right? He beats Verdecia. Now, I'm not going to pretend that that's a big win, but he only get finished against Dan Severn. Granted, he was losing that fight, but it was a doctor stoppage to a cut. He wasn't either beaten to an absolute pulp or so decisively that you could say, like, Dan Severn just ran him ragged and destroyed him. But you come back for UFC 6, you win that tournament, you beat Dave Beneteau, who got to the final of UFC 5. So you've beaten a finalist, you've beaten another finalist, Tank Abbott, and you go into the super fight with Ken Shamrock and you draw with him after 33 minutes in what is one of the worst fights I've ever seen in my entire life. But Ken Shamrock's still top level opposition. And then when you make your return after drawing the super fight, he beats Dave Beneteau again, so he's beaten a finalist twice. He then beats a winner, Marco Ruas, and again, boring decision, but Marco Ruas is pretty fucking good. And then he loses in the ultimate final to Dan Severn. So his losses are only to Dan Severn, who's going to rank quite highly on this list, and you drew against Ken Shamrock. So, like, I don't think that's too bad, and I could maybe make an argument for making him number 5 on this list, but I think number 5 is ranked low enough that any fans on here of this guy are about to have a complete fucking meltdown. But we'll get to number 5, and that is Royce Gracie. Okay, so I'm about to absolutely fucking debunk the myth that is Royce Gracie, because yes, a 3-time tournament champion is ranking number fucking 5 right now. Art Jimerson, give me a fucking break, okay? Turns up wearing a fucking boxing glove to fight a guy in a gi. Ken Shamrock, okay, you beat him in that first tournament. Okay, cool, that's a fine win. Fine win. Gerard Jordeau in the UFC 1 tournament final had a broken hand and had cut his foot up on his last opponent's face. Ichihara tapped before any extension was made in an armbar or before any choke attempt was made. Jason DeLucia, okay, you did beat him. He was tapping for his life and the referee just chose not to intervene. But you beat him. Remco Pardol, you choked him out with his own gi until you realise in the highlights that the gi wasn't even round his neck, it was sitting on his chin. You beat Patrick Smith with nothing in the UFC 2 tournament final. You hit him with some, straights from the top, and he just fucking tapped out, put up 0 fight whatsoever. You beat Kimo at UFC 3, except he actually made contact with your face, and then you acted as though you had been shot and then couldn't continue. And you will see on the screen here, I have in brackets 11-1-1. That's because you turned up to the octagon, and this is directly to Royce Gracie, by the way. Turned up to the octagon and then threw in the towel. That's a fucking loss, right? They don't count it as a loss for whatever reason, but when you turn up, you make the walk and you step into the octagon, that's it, you're in there. That is a fucking loss when you throw in the towel. We then get to UFC 4, you beat Ron Van Cleef, a 51-year-old karate teacher. You then beat Keith Hackney, who, okay, Keith Hackney, whatever. And then you beat Dan Severn by pure luck after he rode you for 15 minutes, and you managed to just, catch him in a triangle. And then at UFC 5, your final appearance, you definitely lost to Ken Shamrock, except there was no judges, so it got called a time limit draw after 36 minutes. And then you left the promotion once your brother wasn't involved in matchmaking anymore and couldn't set the rules up for you. So when we started to bring in time limits to stop you doing this bullshit, you decided to go. And yeah, number 5 is as high as you're going. That is it. That is my entire piece on Royce Gracie. He does come in at number 5 because of his 3 tournament wins, but again, asterisks next to these tournament wins when your brother's making the matches for you. You can decide if this is too high or too low, but moving on, number 4, Mark Coleman. Coleman only joined us at UFC 10, and after just joining us, his wins over Gary Goodridge and Don Frye. And when those are 2 out of your 3 wins, you have to rank quite highly on this list, especially when you come in here, you win your first tournament so decisively. Just said that he beat Don Frye, and if you haven't guessed, Don Frye ranks higher on the GOAT list than Mark Coleman currently in terms of what we've seen so far in UFC, and I'll tell you for why. See, going into that fight, in that tournament final, Don Frye had already fought for 5 more minutes than Mark Coleman had done already. Don Frye already had a black eye and cut, which was then opened up during the fight by Mark Coleman, which then led to the doctor stoppage. Or, I mean, look, they have it down here as a TKO. The fight gets stopped and the doctor checked on Don Frye and they then called the fight. I can't say that you're better than Don Frye because the doctor stopped the fight on a cut that, while you might have opened up, you didn't actually cause, you know what I mean? Like the swelling and that, it was already there before you headbutted it. So that's not to take away from his win here, right? He definitely won decisively, clearly, whatever. He beat Don Frye, and look, I can't rank you higher than him just based on that one tournament. You do have a good win over Gary Goodridge. Again, I don't know why I'm saying you as though this is directed straight to Mark Coleman, but he does have a good win over Goodridge. He does have a good win over Don Frye, but based on that one tournament, I can't have you higher than these next 3 guys on the list. Speaking of these next 3 guys on the list, we have number 3 taking the bronze medal on the GOAT list. We have the former super fight champion Ken Shamrock. In fact, before we actually get to Shamrock, anybody having a problem with me marking Mark Coleman above Royce Gracie, you're telling me that if these 2 fought, Mark Coleman wouldn't smash the fuck out of Royce Gracie? You're out of your mind. Number 3, Ken Shamrock. Shamrock made his debut at UFC 1. He beat Patrick Smith easily with a heel hook. He then lost to Royce Gracie, which is just a shame, to be honest. UFC 3, he won 2 of his fights and then get injured before the final, and that is what puts Shamrock here at number 3 instead of 2, to be honest, is the fact that he never won a tournament. He definitely could have done, though. Like I said in the last part of this series that we're doing, UFC 3 would have been perfect for a Shamrock tournament win, but it just was not to be. He then checked out a tournament competition and started the super fights. The first one against Royce Gracie, time limit draw, which if there was judges, he would have won. So, you know, there is that. He then went on to beat Dan Severn in what was probably his best super fight, to be honest. He beat him in a couple of minutes. Now, maybe Shamrock should be number 2, but I'm going to stick to my guns and keep him here at number 3 because I can't get over the bullshit that this man has made me sit through and watch. After he beat Severn, right, you're thinking, okay, the worst of it's over. We had the just terrible matchup with Royce Gracie, which, okay, if there was judges, he would have won. We move into the Severn fight. He wins decisively. Nice watch. We then go into the Oleg Taktarov fight at UFC 7, and things are bleak. 33 minutes. It was a 3-minute overtime, and a draw. Another one that if there was judges, he would have won. They ended up bringing judges in after this. But then we go on to the next super fight. He beats Kimo. Definitely the least reputable name of the super fights. But look, you can only beat what's in front of you. He won that decisively. He then ended up losing the super fight title to Dan Severn in one of the worst fights I have ever seen in my life, which is actually a theme now here with Shamrock, where he has these long, boring matchups. But he loses via split decision. He loses the super fight title. And I can't even say decisively beaten because they literally made no contact. Severn got the upper hand in the few exchanges. Are you hearing me say this right now? There was a half-hour fight that had a few exchanges, but like he didn't beat Dan Severn there, and I think it could just be complete recency bias because he ended up finishing him in the first fight, remember? But I just think Dan Severn has to rank higher than Ken Shamrock. But we will get to Dan Severn, but not just yet. Number 2, Don Frye. Don Frye made his first appearance here at UFC 8, going on a 6-fight win streak, winning one tournament. They didn't have a tournament at UFC 9, but given who they had at UFC 9 to appear, he 100% would have won that. And then UFC 10 making it to the final, only to lose to Mark Coleman, who had fought for 5 less minutes than he had over the course of the night. Now, see, considering how I've ranked the rest of this list, you might be thinking that, okay, this is a bit biased, okay, because you like Don Frye. But see, if you look at who I've ranked below Don Frye, see just in a normal fit, like just as if all these guys faced each other in the first round, I think Don Frye beats Shamrock. I think Don Frye would beat Coleman if, like, both guys are starting from an equal point of view or an equal jumping off point, right? If there isn't that 5-minute difference in stamina or whatever. See if that fight against Coleman hadn't got stopped and they'd kept fighting for 2 or 3 more minutes, I think you would have seen the tide turn and Don Frye would have won that. Spoke about ranking these guys in terms of, okay, who they've lost to. Don Frye only lost to Mark Coleman. Where I've spoke about other people ranking in terms of their wins and who they've beaten, Don Frye hasn't really beaten anybody to this point. He beat Gary Goodridge, which is a fine win. And Brian Johnson, honestly, he only came in at UFC 10, but he's pretty good too. So he doesn't have these insane wins over top level competition. But again, I think he beats Shamrock. I think he beats Coleman, all things being equal. I think he beats Gracie. I think he beats Taktarov. I would have loved to have seen him fight Ruas, to be honest, because skill for skill, I think those are 2 of the most well-rounded guys on this list. If we were doing pound for pound skill level, those 2 would probably be 1 and 2. But anyway, Don Frye comes in here at number 2, and I'm not going to hear it, okay? Yeah, okay, he lost to Coleman. He doesn't have maybe the wins or the names that a Shamrock has, but Don Frye beat Shamrock in a fight, I'm telling you right now. So that means there can only be one, and look, you already know who it is. We mentioned his name already. Number 1, Dan the Beast Severn. He is our original UFC GOAT. The one, the only Triple Crown UFC champion. He won the UFC 5 tournament. He won the Ultimate 1995 and the Super Fight title. Debuted at UFC 4, dominated his first 2 fights before losing in the final to Royce Gracie. After killing him for 15 minutes, he just threw his own self into a guillotine. Not a guillotine, a triangle. Why? Why did you do these things? Comes back for UFC 5, gets the event named after him, just smashes everybody. Taktarov and Beneteau in there as 2 names on his tournament win, which is pretty fucking good. He then goes into the super fight, UFC 6. He loses to Shamrock in a couple of minutes. Not a great showing. Not great. But he redeems himself at the Ultimate, beating Varlins, who was a tournament finalist. He beats Tank Abbott, who was a tournament finalist. And he beat Oleg Taktarov, who was a UFC tournament winner. So winning your second tournament, winning the Ultimate, having beat 2 runners-up and a winner is pretty fucking good. He then goes in and wins the super fight title from Ken Shamrock, again in one of the worst fights I've ever seen in my entire life. But similarly to Shamrock, he kind of has a reputation now at this point of taking these boring fights to a fucking decision, like his last 3, Tank Abbott 18 minutes, Taktarov half an hour, Shamrock half an hour. And okay, the Tank Abbott one wasn't terrible, but Taktarov and Shamrock, I mean, Jesus Christ. But look, his only 2 losses, Ken Shamrock, Royce Gracie, they aren't, as much as I slated Royce Gracie and basically called him a fraud, he is top 5 to this point, and look, he's subbed a few people. Ken Shamrock at this point, again, look, he's number 3 here, and could be you could argue Shamrock is number 2, but getting that win back over him in the most recent fight, to me, puts him above Shamrock. You look at the rest of his wins, he's beat Taktarov, a tournament winner, twice, beaten Tank Abbott, who was a finalist, Paul Varlins, who was a finalist, Ken Shamrock, he beat, like, he has some really good names on his list here, and that is enough. Besides the fact that, again, Triple Crown UFC winner, an Ultimate, a tournament, a super fight title. This guy is the GOAT, even if his fights can be boring as fuck. Dan Severn is your winner. He is the original GOAT of the UFC. What do you think? Tell me in the comments below. I can sense some unhappy people in the chat right now. But look, comment. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Was I wildly off? Did I get some things right? Dan Severn being number one is the correct answer. But look, let me know. Subscribe right now for more content. We have more on the way, both modern day and old school. Remember to like the video. Again, comment your own thoughts below. I'm gonna have an eager eye on these comments. And look, till next time, we're gonna rank the whole events next, UFC 1 through to UFC 10. But look, until next time, that is it. Remember, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all very soon.